on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. He raises up kings and rulers cast down, appointing all boundaries and times. The power he gives to whomever he will, but yields not control from on high. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. The proud he collapses, the holy he saves, submission of hearts he demands. The nations who willingly humble themselves will be the dominions that stand. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. A stone from a mountain cut out without hands, this kingdom will never be conquered. Against it hell's gate shall never prevail, its throne will be left to no other. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. That throne sits on high in the depths of men's hearts, won over by willing surrender. A warfare with weapons to carnal affair, no tyrant our king but our Father. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man.
Today, I want to share with you this wonderful story about Daniel and the lion's den. Now, it's probably, because it's so well known, it's probably known by most of you. But I want us to take a look at this story today. And I want us to see maybe there's something else that we can learn from it. Now, the reason why we're looking at Daniel at this time period is because he fits in right where we've been looking at since the beginning of this year at creation. We've looked at what has happened with Israel. We've seen that whenever Israel as a whole, the northern tribes were taken into exile, the southern tribes were taken into exile, and Daniel was right there among them all. And he experienced that whole time of exile. There were 70 years of exile, and Daniel was there for all the different kingdoms that came and that fell during that time. And it's actually during that last kingdom of those 70 years that this story takes place. See, we know of Daniel going to Babylon, but it's not in Babylon anymore that Daniel and the lion's den take place. This is with the Medes and the Persians. We'll see that in the story. But the Persians are the ones who actually released the Jewish people to let them go back to their homeland and build and rebuild the temple and rebuild just their civilization again. So it's during that time period that Daniel still finds himself in a form of exile, but look what he's doing whenever he is exiled, because he is constantly praising God and is faithful to him. I think there's a lesson for us as well. This story takes place in Daniel chapter 6. Now, whenever you look about Daniel chapter 6, you find out that what has happened is Darius, he's the one who is the king, and at this point he's also Daniel, by this time, is an old man. Many times we kind of think about him being younger. No, by this point, he's like an old man, about 70 or plus by this point in history. And Darius is the king who is setting Daniel up as one of these wise men, one of these ones who's as an administrator. In fact, in verse 3, we read that now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel is about to be raised up as to the highest of the high in the kingdom. Now this story sounds like some of the other ones that we've heard before, right? Whenever like Joseph was taken into the land of Egypt, he was raised up by God. Daniel is the same thing is happening to him, or the similar type thing is happening because he distinguished himself. Now, I mean, we know it's not really Daniel who's doing it, it's the Lord who's working through him. But because Daniel is so faithful to God, he's a great guy. He's a wonderful guy. You definitely want him by your side, and you want him in charge. Look with me at the next few verses. Verses 4 and 5 even talk about how people who were trying to find fault in him, they couldn't. They couldn't find any corruption in him. It stated that he was trustworthy and he was neither corrupt nor negligent. By the way, I think there's a lesson for us in how we should just be as people as well. Can the same thing be stated about us? Look at verse 5. These people who are trying to trap him, finally these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So they're trying to find a trap, and guess what? They do. They actually make a trap, and they convince the king that he needs to set up this decree or this edict, this decree. That's what that's what these men try to tell him. They say, "Hey, this is what you need to do." And here's the weird decree that's mentioned in verse 7 right here. It says that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, that's the king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. So that's the trap, because they know, well, Daniel's not going to do that. Is he? Or is he? I mean, they don't exactly know, but they think, well, maybe this can be the exact thing we need to get rid of Daniel, because they don't like him. He's rising up in power. They want that power. They want to be the ones in control. So how is Daniel going to respond? Well, this lesson is titled Daniel in the Lion's Den, so we know he's not going to listen to that decree, and he ends up in a lion's den. So here we have in verse 10 that this is what we read. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. He didn't let what the law said about following his God, he didn't let it stop him. He was going to do what he knew was right. He knew that there was importance in Jerusalem. That was the promised land to the people of Israel. He knew it was promised to him as well. And he was accepting that promise. That's why he opened his windows toward Jerusalem. And he prayed 3 times a day, all throughout his day, so that way he was always focused on God, following him. He bowed before God and he prayed, and notice that he gave thanks to his God. Even though he was in a foreign land, he gave thanks to God, just as he had done before. Well, verses 13 through 15 speak about how this trap became known, and it worked. And then we see here in verse 14 that the king hears about this, because the men bring him before them, and they're like, "Hey, you said that anybody who goes against this is going to be thrown into the lion's den." And then they say, "Hey, Daniel's been going against it." But when the king, look at this in verse 14, that whenever the king heard about this, he was greatly distressed. Why is he distressed? Well, he was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown to save him. There is something about Daniel that King Darius likes so much that he's trying to save him. He's trying to figure out a way to get around this trap that had been set, because he apparently wasn't paying much attention to putting that into decree, putting that edict in force. But because he has to follow what the law says, Daniel does go into the lion's den. And here we have in verse 16, "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.'" You realize that even while the king is throwing Daniel into the lion's den, he doesn't want to do it, but he found no way around it, so now he's just throwing him into the lion's den. While he's throwing him into the lion's den, he tells him, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Daniel's lifestyle made an impact all the way up to the king. In fact, the king is so concerned about it, in verse 18, we find out that he spent the whole night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. This was disturbing him very, very greatly. He wanted to be able to do something to help him, but he knew it was really out of his control at this point, and he said, "Well, maybe God will show mercy to you. Maybe God will rescue you somehow." Well, let's keep reading. Verses 19 and 20. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Has your God been able to rescue you from the lions? Now, is God able to rescue him from the lions? I mean, we know that God is able. I mean, what can God not do? We know that. But now, King Darius, this king of Persia, has that question, was your God able? You know, Daniel, was your God able to rescue you? Yeah, he's able, but did he? Verses 21 and 22. Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent an angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his eyes, in his sight, sorry. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The Lord saved him. The Lord was not only able to deliver him, but he did deliver him. He did rescue him. And you know, sometimes God saves us or rescues us from hard times. But then also sometimes God rescues us or saves us through hard times. Now, see, in this case of Daniel, it kind of goes a little bit of both ways because Daniel was rescued, but he still had to be in the lion's den. I mean, that was not a pleasant experience, but God rescued him. But you know, even if those lions had killed Daniel, because Daniel was faithful to God, we know that God would have delivered. Ultimately, at least, God would have delivered Daniel because he would have been rewarded for his faithfulness. Because being pleasing in God's sight, being faithful to God to the point of death, there is a reward in that. There is a reward to being faithful to God. Then as you keep reading, you find out that the king is so excited. In fact, it says that he is overjoyed. And he gives the reason as to why this was happening, or at least it's stated why it was happened, because he had trusted in his God. That's talking about Daniel. Daniel had trusted in his God. That's why there wasn't any problems with him at all. And then what we find out in verses 24 and around that is that those people who tried to hurt Daniel, they themselves were thrown into the lion's den. So this trap that they set up, this whole scheme that they had, they ended up falling into it themselves. And here we look at Daniel's faith. We see that because he trusted in his God, it made an impact. It made an impact to Daniel. It made an impact to the king. And this type of faith, it causes a reaction, and it did to the king. That's why we read in verses 25 through 28. Listen to this right here. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Now, as far as we know, King Darius did not grow up worshiping the God of Daniel, but because of this act and because of what he found out from Daniel, there is something about the God that Daniel serves. And he describes how people are to behave. And he describes this God of Daniel like this. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So what we see right here, this decree that was issued praising God, saying that he is a living God, he endures forever, his kingdom is not going to be destroyed, his dominion never ends, he rescues, he saves, he performs signs and wonders, and he has rescued Daniel. All that was such great praise of Daniel and Daniel's God from a pagan king. It's because of the faith that Daniel had. Did you know that whenever we have faith like this, it still makes a huge impact today? If you want to fast forward now with me, let's look at what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 and what living like Daniel would look like in today's world. 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 11 through 12. Peter says, Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. This is what we are called. He's talking about the church, and he calls us all foreigners and exiles. So there's a lot of similarities that we have with Daniel. But he says to us, Peter says to the church, to us, that we are called to live such good lives among the pagans. That's what Daniel was doing. He was living a good life among the pagans so that they could see his good deeds and be able to glorify God. People can glorify God because of seeing our good deeds. That is why we should be living these good lives among people so that they can see our good deeds, see our example, and glorify our Father who is in heaven. Peter goes on and tells us a little bit more about what this looks like on a day-to-day basis. Listen to this. We are called to do this. Verses 13 through 17. We're told to submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. This is what it looks like to live the type of lives that are pleasing to God, to live these good lives that are pleasing to God. We are called to submit to all these different human authorities that come up. That's the same type of thing that Daniel did. Now, what does submission look like? Well, it looks like with Daniel, that even he was submitting to the king, he still disobeyed an edict because it was an edict that should have never been put into place. He had the freedom, the God-given right to worship God in the way that he saw fit. And that's exactly what he did. He worshiped God the way that God asked us to worship him. That is also what we are called to do as well. And we are called to live as free people. This past week, for those of us in the United States, which I assume is most people who are going to get a hold of this video, we just celebrated the 4th of July, Independence Day and our freedom. We are called, even from the Bible, to live as free people, but to not use our freedom as a cover-up for evil. Have you ever seen somebody do that? Sure you have. We see it all the time whenever people say, well, it's my freedom. I'm free to do whatever I want. Yeah, you're free to do whatever you want, but there's consequences to it. And we as Christians cannot just use our freedom as some type of cover-up from evil. No. We are slaves of God. No matter how free in this life we are God's slaves. And that's not a bad thing. It's just we are his servants. We are called for that purpose. That is why we are made, to serve God, to be faithful to him. We are called to show the proper respect to everyone, to love the family of believers, to love Christians, fear God, and honor the emperor. Honor the one who is in charge, the ones who are in charge. And remember, verse 15 says that this is God's will. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. If we live lives like what Daniel lived, how could it change the world today? Let's live those types of lives because it is God's will, and let's see how it will change the world in which we live.
God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? I cry to you with all my power. Through the veil of Jesus' flesh, from this valley strewn with tears, I can climb up to the mountain of the Father. For he lives to hear the pleas from his children worn and weak, as they come into his presence with their praise. God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? I cry to you with all my power. I can pray in Jesus' name for my will to be the same. For the Father wants to mold me in his image. For he knows what's best for me. If I'm bound or if I'm free, I can come into his presence with my praise. God, can you can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? I know that God, you will hear, you will hear, you will